46 years ago today, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior. All 29 crew members aboard died.
Deep beneath the freezing, black waters of Lake Superior, something has waited in silence for nearly 5 decades. A steel giant. A graveyard. A mystery that has refused every attempt at a final answer, until now. A team of researchers recently sent a state-of-the-art underwater drone into those dark depths, descending more than 500 feet toward the wreck of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. And what the cameras captured down there didn't just surprise the experts on board. It shook them. Because what they found wasn't simply the remains of a sunken ship. It was evidence. Evidence that changes the story of one of the most haunting maritime tragedies in American history, and raises uncomfortable questions about what we thought we knew. To understand why this discovery matters so deeply, you first have to understand what the Edmund Fitzgerald meant to the people who knew her. She wasn't just a cargo ship. She was a statement. When she was launched in June of 1958, from the River Rouge shipyard in Michigan, she was the largest vessel ever constructed for service on the Great Lakes. At 729 feet in length, she dwarfed nearly everything else on the water. Her burgundy hull cut a striking figure against the gray skies of the northern lakes, and her sheer scale inspired a kind of reverence among sailors, dock workers, and the families of port towns who watched her pass beneath bridges and along coastlines with a slow, majestic grace. She was built to haul taconite iron or dense, heavy pellets mined from the ranges near Duluth, Minnesota, and transported south to the steel mills of Detroit and Toledo. It was unglamorous work by most measures, but the Fitzgerald performed it with an almost theatrical authority. She could carry more than 26,000 tons of cargo in a single voyage. She set speed records on the lakes. She completed crossing after crossing without serious incident, and over the course of her 17 years of active service, she became something rare in the industrial world, a machine that people genuinely loved. Crews returned to her year after year. Shorewatchers timed their afternoons around her scheduled passages. Children in lakeside towns grew up knowing her name before they knew much else about the world of commerce and industry. Her captain on that final voyage was Ernest McSorley, a man who had spent decades navigating the Great Lakes and who had commanded the Fitzgerald long enough to know her rhythms and her moods as well as he knew his own. He was not a reckless man. He was not cavalier about weather or risk. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of experienced, methodical captain you would want in charge of a vessel that sighs on waters as unpredictable as Lake Superior. That matters. Because when everything went wrong, it did not go wrong because of recklessness or poor judgment. It went wrong in ways that no one on board could have detected, predicted, or stopped. On November 9, 1975, the Fitzgerald departed the port of Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with more than 26,000 tons of taconite pellets and bound for a steel mill in Detroit. The weather forecast, while not perfect, gave no indication of what was coming. A storm system was developing to the west, but systems like that were part of November sailing on the Great Lakes. Great Lakes mariners had a phrase for November. They called it the Witch of November, because that month had a long reputation for producing the most violent and unpredictable weather of the year. But ships sailed in November because commerce didn't stop. The ore had to move. The mills needed material. And the Fitzgerald, with her record of reliability, seemed as capable as any vessel on the water of handling whatever the season threw at her. By November 10th, that storm had become something far beyond what forecasters had anticipated. Wind speeds climbed past 70 miles per hour. Wave heights exceeded 25 feet, with some reports from vessels in the area suggesting that certain wave formations reached even higher, stacking on top of each other in the confused, shallowish geometry of Lake Superior's eastern basin. The Fitzgerald was not alone out there. The Arthur M. Anderson, another freighter, was trailing her by roughly 10 miles, and the two ships had been maintaining regular radio communication throughout the day. Captain McSorley and the captain of the Anderson, Jesse Cooper, were keeping each other updated on conditions, sharing radar readings, and navigating the storm together in the way that experienced mariners do, not because either captain was afraid, but because that was simply good seamanship. The radio exchanges between the two ships that afternoon have been studied, transcribed, and analyzed hundreds of times in the decade since. They reveal a picture of growing difficulty but not of panic. Around mid-afternoon, McSorley reported that the Fitzgerald had developed a list, a lean to one side, and that a vent had been lost somewhere on the deck. He also noted that one of the hatch covers was causing concern. But his tone remained steady. He described the situation as manageable. He said they were holding their own. Those words, "We are holding our own," would turn out to be the last communication ever received from the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Shortly after 7:10 in the evening, the Anderson's radar operator looked at his screen and found nothing. The Fitzgerald had vanished. Not gradually. Not with a distress call or a flare or any signal of any kind. She was simply gone. 29 men, gone with her, in an instant. The search that followed was vast and heartbreaking and ultimately fruitless in the most important sense. Searchers found debris. They found some lifeboats and life rafts, uninflated and apparently never deployed. They found a few pieces of equipment. They did not find survivors. They did not find bodies. The lake, as it had done before with other ships and other men, kept its dead. Within days, the search shifted from rescue to recovery, and then to investigation. The question that gripped everyone, maritime officials, engineers, the grieving families, the general public, was simple and devastating in equal measure. How? How does a ship that size, crewed by experienced sailors, navigating waters she had crossed hundreds of times before, simply disappear without a single distress call? The Coast Guard investigation that concluded in 1977 pointed toward hatch cover failure as the most probable cause. The theory held that the covers over the ship's cargo holds, large panels held down by steel clamps, had not been properly secured, or had been damaged by the waves, allowing water to enter the holds gradually throughout the day. Under that scenario, the flooding would have been slow enough to be initially undetectable, but relentless enough that by the time the ship's list became apparent to McSorley, the situation was already beyond recovery. The holds would have filled, the bow would have plunged downward, and the ship would have dived beneath the surface in a matter of seconds. Too fast for any distress signal, too fast for any lifeboat, too fast for any of the 29 men to do anything at all. Not everyone accepted this conclusion. The National Transportation Safety Board offered a different assessment, suggesting that the Fitzgerald may have experienced a catastrophic structural failure, possibly breaking apart on the surface before sinking. Others proposed that the ship had struck an uncharted shoal in the hours before she went down, damaging her hull below the waterline and causing flooding that the crew either didn't detect or couldn't stop. Some pointed to the phenomenon of rogue waves, massive, isolated walls of water that can form suddenly in large lakes and oceans and strike with devastating force. The debate went on for years. 4 decades. And without survivors, without a flight data recorder equivalent, without anything that could settle the question with physical certainty, it remained genuinely, stubbornly open. Early dives to the wreck, conducted in the years following the sinking, were limited by the technology of their time. Side-scan sonar could produce rough outlines of the wreck's position and general shape, but the resolution was far too low to reveal meaningful structural detail. Submersible cameras produced grainy, difficult-to-interpret footage. Researchers could see that the ship had broken in two, the bow section lying relatively upright in the sediment, the stern section inverted and twisted nearby, but the finer details that might have told the real story remained frustratingly out of reach. The wreck was there. The answers were there, presumably, somewhere in that cold darkness. But the tools to extract them didn't yet exist. They do now. In recent years, remotely operated underwater vehicles have reached a level of sophistication that would have seemed extraordinary to the researchers who conducted those early dives. The ROV used in the most recent expedition to the Fitzgerald's resting place was equipped with multiple high-powered floodlights capable of illuminating the wreck in genuine detail, cameras recording in full 4K resolution, advanced sonar arrays, and AI-assisted scanning systems that could generate real-time 3-dimensional models of whatever the drone sensors encountered. The vehicle's thrusters were calibrated for extremely slow, precise movement, allowing it to navigate through fragile wreck environments without disturbing the structure or stirring up sediment that would cloud the cameras. It was, as one of the engineers on the expedition described it, a fundamentally different instrument from anything that had previously visited the site. The descent took time. 530 feet of cold, dark water lay between the surface and the lakebed, and the drone moved through it deliberately, its lights cutting narrow swaths of visibility through water that had not seen light of any kind in decades. The team in the control room above watched their screens as the murk gradually resolved into shapes, first indistinct, then increasingly recognizable. And then, unmistakably, there she was. The bow of the Edmund Fitzgerald, standing upright in the sediment, her hull darkened with rust and decades of algae and lake sediment, massive and somehow still imposing even in ruin. Fish moved slowly through the beams of the floodlights. Everything was utterly still. The team began their survey systematically, moving the drone along the hull and over the forward deck, documenting everything the cameras could capture. The imagery they were gathering was extraordinary, millimeter-level resolution in near-total darkness, revealing details of the ship's structure that had never been visible before. Rivet lines, paint striations, stress fractures in the steel. And then, as the drone moved over the forward cargo hatches, something stopped the survey in its tracks. A hatch clamp was missing. Not corroded away gradually, not simply worn down, missing. Gone. The steel fitting that should have been there, one of 22 clamps designed to hold each hatch cover sealed against even the most violent wave action, simply wasn't present. As the drone continued forward and the cameras swept across the second and third hatches, the same pattern repeated itself. Missing clamps. Bent clamps. Clamps twisted out of alignment in ways that suggested they had been subjected to enormous, repeated force. In some cases, the hardware appeared to have been torn free rather than simply worn away. What was emerging wasn't an isolated finding. It was a pattern across multiple hatches, a systemic failure of the very mechanisms that were supposed to keep the lake out of the ship's interior. Then the drone's cameras found the vent pipe. Or rather, they found where the vent pipe should have been. One of the forward cargo vents, a steel pipe designed to equalize pressure in the hold during cargo operations, had been sheared completely off at its base, leaving an open ring of steel that led directly into the interior of the ship. No cover. No seal. Nothing between the raging surface of Lake Superior and the cargo hold below except several hundred feet of icy water that was now free to pour straight in. The structural engineer reviewing the footage described it plainly. An open hole leading directly into the ship's most vulnerable spaces, exposed to whatever the lake chose to send through it. The implications of these findings, taken together, were staggering. Consider the conditions that night: waves in excess of 25 feet, winds above 70 miles per hour, and a ship moving at speed through water that was actively breaking over her bow and sweeping her forward deck with every wave. With hatch clamps missing or compromised and a vent pipe sheared off, water would not have merely seeped into the cargo holds. It would have entered in volume, continuously, driven by every wave that crashed across the deck. Simulations run by the expedition team suggested that under those conditions, water could have been entering the ship at a rate of several thousand gallons per minute. At that rate, a vessel the size of the Fitzgerald would have become critically unstable within approximately 30 minutes. And here is the part that is genuinely difficult to sit with: the crew almost certainly didn't know. The flooding was happening below the cargo hold floor, out of sight, in spaces that sailors wouldn't routinely access during a storm. The ship would have felt increasingly heavy and sluggish, and she would have developed the list that McSorley reported to the Anderson. But the sensation of a ship taking on water in her deepest interior is not the same as the sensation of obvious flooding. There is no alarm. There is no visible waterline creeping up the walls. The water is simply accumulating somewhere out of sight, adding weight, changing the ship's balance, pulling the bow incrementally lower with each passing minute. McSorley's assessment that they were holding their own was almost certainly his genuine, honest evaluation of what he could observe. What he couldn't observe was killing them. The drone also revealed something that cast a shadow over not just the final voyage but the years that preceded it. Close inspection of certain hatch fittings showed evidence of repairs and component replacements that appeared to have been made at various points during the ship's operational life. Some clamps were not original to the ship. Some fittings showed signs of having been replaced with parts that may not have been exact matches for the original hardware. This suggested that the hatch hardware had been experiencing stress and failure issues for some time before that November night. Issues that had been addressed with repairs, but perhaps not addressed with the seriousness or urgency that the situation warranted. If problems with the hatch clamps had been identified and patched repeatedly over the years, the question of whether those problems were fully understood and properly escalated becomes a deeply uncomfortable one. What the drone footage has done, in the most fundamental sense, is transform a theory into evidence. The 1977 Coast Guard report's conclusion about hatch failure had always been credible to many maritime engineers, but it had been criticized for resting on inference rather than direct physical proof. The footage changes that. It shows, in clear and unambiguous detail, the physical condition of the hatch hardware at the moment of sinking. Hardware that was compromised in ways that align precisely with the flooding scenario that the Coast Guard described. This is not speculation anymore. This is the wreck speaking for itself, through the cameras of a machine that can see what human eyes never could. For the maritime engineering community, the findings carry implications that extend well beyond the Fitzgerald herself. The hatch design, clamp systems, and vent configurations used on the Fitzgerald were not unique to her. They were standard across many Great Lakes freighters of her generation. Ships built with the same assumptions, the same hardware specifications, the same maintenance expectations. If the Fitzgerald's hatch system was vulnerable to the kind of cumulative stress and failure pattern the drone footage suggests, then other vessels of the same era may have carried similar vulnerabilities. Some of those ships sailed on for years after 1975 without incident, which might indicate that the Fitzgerald situation was particularly severe, or it might indicate that other ships were simply luckier. The question deserves serious examination. Modern cargo vessels are built with redundancy in mind. Secondary sealing systems, flood detection equipment, double hull construction in critical areas, real-time monitoring of cargo hold conditions. These are features that have become standard in contemporary ship design, driven in large part by tragedies like the Fitzgerald. But in 1975, none of these systems were present on ships like her. The ship's survival in a severe storm depended entirely on every component of her exterior, every clamp, every seal, every vent, functioning as designed, simultaneously, under the most extreme conditions imaginable. There was no backup. There was no redundancy. There was no warning system that could have told McSorley what was happening below his feet. When the system failed, it failed completely and silently, and the crew had no recourse. For the families of the 29 men who were lost that night, the footage carries a particular weight. 4 decades, they have lived with not just grief but uncertainty, the particular, grinding uncertainty of not knowing exactly what happened to their fathers and brothers and sons and husbands in those final minutes. The various theories that circulated over the years gave them different narratives to contend with, and some of those narratives were harder to accept than others. The suggestion of hatch failure, in its earliest formulations, sometimes implied that errors had been made in securing the hatches, errors that could be attributed to the crew. For families who knew these men, who knew their professionalism and their experience and their dedication, that implication was deeply painful. What the drone footage suggests is something quite different. It suggests that the men on board the Edmund Fitzgerald did nothing wrong. They sailed into a severe storm, as they had done many times before, in a ship that had sailed through many such storms before. They monitored conditions. They communicated with the Anderson. They managed the situation as best they could with the information they had. What they could not have known was that the infrastructure keeping their ship afloat was failing in ways that were invisible to them, in spaces they couldn't see, at a rate that outpaced their ability to detect or respond. They were not failed by their own decisions. They were failed by the ship's design limitations and, perhaps, by a maintenance and inspection culture that did not adequately address the warning signs that were apparently present in the hardware.